Welcome, everyone, wherever you are at this moment in the world. And thank you for tuning in today for this very special conversation with Dr. Vishakha Desai to tackle the question, where is home together? My name is Junjie. This is an honor to be joined today by my talented colleagues, Shagun and Yasmine. As we start, we do want to inform our audience that this event is being recorded. Now, since the official release of World as Family in May, we've heard so many praises already from people such as Irina Bokova, the former head of UNESCO, and Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. But Dr. Desai's book has touched so many of us young, perhaps not yet so prominent people, as it surely moved Yasmine, Shagun, and myself. Personally, the book has reduced me to tears more than I'd like to admit. Three of us thought that Dr. Desai's message of a globally engaged but multi-rooted sense of belonging could speak to young people like us and help us navigate the complexity and uncertainty of life. In her book, Dr. Desai traces her memory as a child growing up in India, arriving in America for the first time as an AFS exchange student, college, a somewhat sensational first marriage, to her career, where she eventually became the icon in academia and in the museum world that she is today. The book leaves us with her current reflections as a teacher and an educator at Columbia University and beyond. World as Family truly is written with young people in mind, as it offers insights, encouragements, and more importantly, a sense of companionship for each of our individual journey. Dr. Desai, Vishakha, it is truly a privilege. Shagun, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I want to first start with introducing our panel today and wherever people are from. This is a very exciting moment for me because I get to work with such smart people, including Yasmine and Rek, but also to be on this panel with one of my icons, one of my mentors, someone who I'm so proud to know and just include in my life, include in my conversations. So today we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Vishakha Desai, who currently serves as a senior advisor for global affairs to the president at Columbia University. She's the department chair of the Committee on Global Thought and is a senior research scholar in global studies at its School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. Prior to joining Columbia, Dr. Desai held various positions, as Rek told you about. She was the president of the Asia Society for about 8 years. Then we have Rek, who grew up in China. He is a recent alum of the Global Thought program at Columbia. He was a Davis Fellow when he was studying here. Rek graduated from Rene Crown University with an honors and from the Syracuse University's Maxwell School, where he majored in religious studies, environment, sustainability, and policy. He was the co-founder and first convener of the Student Assembly of Interfaith Leaders. Yasmine is a first-year political science student at the European University of Tunis, focusing on law, political sociology, and history. A firm believer in the power of dialogue and communication, she pursues learning languages with a great passion and currently speaks 5 languages. An active member of the Tunisian civil society, she volunteered with Red Crescent and founded an Interact Club in addition to various charity-related interdependent endeavors. She is the co-lead for the events team at One Shared World, a global social organization working towards interdependence. Yasmine is currently a part of the core analysis team for the Youth in a Changing World project with the Committee of Global Thought at Columbia University. I'll also introduce myself. Hi, my name is Shagun. I am a consultant for corporate social responsibility and business and human rights at Grant Thornton. I completed my master's in global thought at Columbia under Dr. Desai and under this wonderful program, which is the Committee on Global Thought. Here I studied on a fellowship. Prior to that, I studied political science and sociology at the University of Delhi. I'm passionate about women's rights and gender, and I was invited to give a TED talk on this as well. I work for global leadership at One Shared World and have been recognized on India's A-list for global leadership and development. I would like to thank all of our partners. I just want to say that this event has completely been organized by youth for youth. I want to give a huge shout out to my co-panelists, Yasmine and Rek, because we got all these partners in on our own. And this is a very proud moment for us because we have such an esteemed list of partners. So we would like to thank them. We would like to thank the Committee on Global Thought, Columbia University, and a special shout out to Andrew for doing all the back end work with all of us. We would like to thank One Shared World, who has sent out thousands of emails, and others also, including MUN Impact, AFS, Columbia Global Centers, Global Youth India, Now and Me, Teach for All, African Leadership Institute, Global China Connection, International House New York, the Office of University Life, Columbia University, Public Affairs, Columbia University, and the MCW Global Young Leaders Conference. Thank you so much for partnering with us. Yasmine, over to you.
So today's program includes an interview with Dr. Vishakha by yours truly and Shagun and Junjie. Then we'll have an open Q&A session. You guys can raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question directly, or you can just type it in the chat. We will be calling first come, first serve. And we're very excited to announce that you get 20% off your order of the book if you do so through Columbia University Press. Also for India and South Asia, you can get it through Penguin Random House and Amazon India. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you. I guess I'll kickstart the interview. So Vishakha, we've heard so much about you already. You are a professor, an esteemed art historian, the former president of the Asia Society, the chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, and an author, also a dancer. Did you ever see this turning out for your journey? How did you get here? And what are some of your advice for young people struggling to navigate their careers?
First of all, thank you, Yasmine, Junjie, and Shagun. I'm just so thrilled to have this conversation with you because, as I say in the book, you all are my global Sherpas. You live in this world. And in a way, this book is inspired by you as much as also a way to think about how you might navigate your world, right? And you will probably teach me a lot more than I have to say to you. So thank you all. Thank you, many of you, for joining us. And now with your question. I think that the question is an important one because I will say to you that I didn't have a grand plan. But I did have a passion. And the passion started actually when I was young as a dancer and also as a first female president of my school. And when I got to meet with political leaders, also through my father. So I sort of had this interest in the cultural side and the political side of the society. And then I come to America at the age of 17, more than 50 years ago, and right in the heart of Vietnam War, and recognizing that actually the intersection of politics and culture was a really important way to think about issues and think about answers to those issues. And so it was kind of that space. So I thought, okay, I'm going to major in political science, then I will do the IR. And I even thought about coming to Columbia at the School of International Relations, right? This was when I was 18 years old. Well, life had a different way of turning, and I found myself actually in Cleveland as a young married woman and recognizing that I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I was looking for a job, just like many of you, when you come out of college and you say, I got to look for something. And it just so happened that I did a performance. But the point I'm making is that then I started in the museum world working with young kids, and especially young African-American kids. And I realized that actually the location could be one thing, but that intersection that I was interested in, which was about arts, culture, and political and social change, could come together in many different ways. So my message to all of you would be clear what you care about and stay open. Be open to opportunities because actually things will come at you from different directions that you hadn't even thought about. However, one thing I would suggest all of you do that I don't do, and I know you all do that, and that is that you're much more strategic about your career. I didn't really have that, and I didn't have a lot of role models to help me either. And I'm just in awe of all of you young people who are really kind of thinking about what kind of volunteerism I do that will get me to this experience. And I do think that getting tools in your toolkit while being aware of the passion you have without saying, okay, I want to be in the C-suite by the time I'm 35. That's too narrow. Just try to actually stay open, get the tools you need, and then continue to move in that direction so that you at least bring yourself, as much of yourself as possible, to the work that you're going to do, because professional life takes a lot of work and a lot of time. So I am not one of those people who says, do your job and then think of your passion separately. As much as possible, bring your passion into your job.
Thank you. So just to summarize, be clear what you care about, sharpen your skills, and
Be
stay
open to
passionate.
possibilities.
Be open to possibilities.
Right.
Thank you.
Terrific.
So this book is an autobiography, but it's also a okay, sorry for that. Some words are just a bit difficult on the tongue. So a piece on multi-rooted belonging and global identity. So in a way, it's an essay and a masterpiece all in one. This is something that is really close to my heart and that I noticed a lot while reading it. And I just wanted to know, how did you decide to curate the book and choose this style of writing?
Thanks, Yasmine. I think that it's a really good question, actually, because I was asked by a number of different people to say, can you write something about your story? And I was saying, what do I care about? And actually, it was by talking to lots and lots of students, AFS students, MA students in global thought, that I realized that this is the moment when global, especially 4 or 5 years ago, with the former US president coming online, I shall not name him, and also what was going on in India at the time, I felt that global was coming under a lot of attack. Lots of people were saying, global is anti-national, global is anti-local, global is sort of the Davos man out there. And most of the work that's done often on the global side is all theoretical, all analytical. And I realized, talking to young people, that it's important actually to create something very personal. So I decided that my story is about learning how to live in this space of capacious global belonging without giving up. I refuse to give up my roots in India or in the United States. And then out of that can emerge actually something even as a third space, and that third space is the global space. So I decided, and it was scary, I have to tell you this. All of us who have done work academically, you asked me to write an exhibition catalog on 17th century Indian painting, no problem. I know how to do that. I didn't know how to write this personal story, but I did know that to be as personal as possible, to be as reflective as possible, and to recognize even the mistakes you've made, that was the only way. As a very dear friend of mine said, the more personal you are, the more universal the message will be. So be personal, and at the same time, create that journey from one to another to the third space. And that was where I said, it's scary, but I'm going to do it. And thankfully, it's been a catalyst for lots of conversations like this.
I think, one of the other things that becomes very important in the book, and, since I've kind of studied under you, and anyone who reads the book or anyone who reads anything about Vishakha will be floored by her immense knowledge. But culture is a very, very important part of your life. It's a part of your career. It's a part of where you are and what you're doing. But personally, also, when you talk about your journey in life, you talk about marriage, you talk about mental health, you talk about finding home, finding yourself, finding this kind of belonging and this kind of identity in this midst of chaos. Could you talk about works, and whether it is art or books or anything, and any form of culture that have had an impact on your journey and how they kind of went with you throughout?
Well, first thing is to recognize that culture is as much about belief, attitudes, way of living, as it is about expressions such as arts, literature, visual images. And so it's both people, occasions, and objects or works that actually I feel you're very right and very perceptive to say that culture plays a very important role for me. And part of it is also because of the intercultural learning that I gained as an early AFS student. But I would say that for me, first group of people are my parents. Because if we think about world as family, I've now begun to realize that that idea begins with your family. And they showed me that how to incorporate different kinds of people in your life. So I saw that. The second one I will say is that my Experiments with Truth by Gandhi was a very important book for me when I was in high school. And I read it in Gujarati first, and then in English. And to recognize, and I saw that in my parents, that to be truly open to others, you have to be truly open to yourself and be honest, to be reflective. And as Gandhi said, that my life is my message. He didn't make a distinction between the message and the way he lived. There are other problems. He was not a saint, he was a human being, but it did make a difference to me. And then it was really amazing works of literature. So from Tagore to, actually one of my favorite writers that really kind of made me thinking about how to think about imagination was The Republic of Imagination by Azar Nafisi, the Iranian-American writer. And then reading books like 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, and being transported to another world. So I felt, and that's partly comes from my father, who was both a writer, a journalist, wrote fiction, but he often talked about how being a freedom fighter and being in the British prison was his best education, because that was when he read books from all over the world. He had the access to them, and it opened his mind. And this was at a time when you couldn't go anywhere. He hadn't traveled anywhere. He would have if he could have, but he didn't. That was just the way the times were. And that kind of opened up the world for me. And then being an art historian, it's often objects. I mean, things like Rembrandt's late portrait just before he died, and that face and the psychology of that face and the way he communicated what it's like. That to me is just one of those things that I do when I go to London. I have 2 days, I'll go and see that work, because it gives me the sense of sheer humanity. So I would say culture is both people, places, occasions, and works.
I think in a way, then that also means that your culture is also multi-rooted, right? Like you talk about Tagore and you talk about Gandhi, and then you move into Rembrandt, and there's so much. And so I think a lot of young people would relate to that, I hope, who are watching this, that, we've grown up with so many different influences around us that it really makes you who you are.
Take the influence from wherever it comes from. And it can come from most unusual places. You'll pick up, I think my father would come to Cambridge when I was in Boston, and he'd go to a bookstore, and his favorite book was Italian Marxist poetry. And you say, why? He said, because it's interesting. I want to know. And that idea is to kind of just be open and be curious and learn. That's one of the ways that you let other influences and other elements come into your life.
Which I think ties into our next question related to the challenges of managing this idea of multi-rootedness, belonging or moving to global belonging. So how does one manage to be locally rooted while also being globally connected? I mean, isn't it confusing to find identity in the midst of all this chaos? Also, can you please connect this to the banyan tree, which we see right here, which represents in the book this multi-rootedness?
Let me first say that it's so important to recognize that this is not a piece of cake, nor is it a walk in the park. To actually try to navigate as you take influences from anywhere, put yourself into uncomfortable positions and learn. It is confusing. There is no question about it. And I do write about that in the book, where you're in one location. Often I say global is contextual, as we often say at the Committee on Global Thought, but even local is contextual. So sometimes I say I have at least 6 different identities. Sometimes I'm an Indian living in America. Sometimes I'm an American who was born in India. Sometimes I'm an Asian American. And sometimes I am an Asian who happens to live in America. Sometimes I'm a New Yorker who is from Ahmedabad. And sometimes I'm an Ahmedabadi girl who actually happens to live in New York. Each one of these are very specific, depending on where I am. And I can tell you when that happens. Sometimes things get confused. So sitting in Ahmedabad, when I'm supposed to actually behave like an American president of an organization in New York, I couldn't quite do it, especially at that moment. So sometimes the wires get crossed and people say, who the hell are you? And you have to say, oh, geez, I forgot about that. And so all I would say is celebrate the messiness, because it's going to be that. Confusion will come up, but the gains of that multiplicity are also such that actually it's worth going through all that. And it's not like there'll be an aha moment, but it is something that will get easier as the time goes on. And often I do say to my younger friends like all of you and my relatives that once you go on this journey, one option you don't have is to belong to only one place and one location. You will actually, in the best of times, belong in multiple places. In the worst of times, you belong nowhere. That's absolutely the case. It's or you can partially belong somewhere. And then you have to recognize that you are kind of in this liminal space. You're an insider and outsider at the same time. So you look at something one way and then you say, oh my God, but that's not the way the other people would think. What that does do is to open up the space without making judgments. And that's why I think this value of empathy, to put yourself in another person's shoe, that opens up that space, as confusing as it may be, actually is needed in the world. And that's why I would argue that all said and done, it is difficult, it's challenging, but worth doing. And last word on the banyan tree. I had actually been always attracted to banyan tree, and I talk about it in the book. And then recognizing that it was a perfect metaphor for me of a global belonging. And that is to be comfortable sitting under the banyan tree and recognizing the roots become branches and branches become roots, and you never really know which one is what. And yet the light comes from outside, the wind is blowing. That sort of reminded me of the wonderful phrase that Gandhi had used at one time, and that is that let us make the floor of our home, of our culture, strong, but let the windows and doors open to let the wind come in so that you learn from the world and let yourself go out in the world. And that seemed like such a perfect metaphor. But I also realized that talking to all of you, I came to this over a lifetime, over many decades of thinking and learning and adding things, all of you are global natives. You work simultaneously in the local world is on your palm, on your cell phone. You're used to doing internet, connecting with people all over the world. We all have learned over time. I've mentioned it in the book that when I came as an AFS student in 1966, you had to make an appointment to make a call internationally. It took 3 days. I had broken my ankle, but I couldn't talk to my parents for 3 days. And if I did, it was for 3 minutes because it was so expensive. Today, look at all of us. We're from all over the world. We can do this. So I realized that each one of us has to find our own metaphor about how to live in this multiple kind of places, if you will. And I think at the same time, that local, national, transnational, and global, think of it as layers. Layers when they fuse, when they come together, like a palimpsest, but they also have their presence. And each one of these actions, especially for climate crisis, which we talked about, Yasmine, is that you can do something very local, but you know that it has a global connection. So think of local in a global context, global in a local context. And that would be the only way. But know that it's not easy. It takes conscious work.
Thank you so much for that.
Vishakha, it is such a beautiful metaphor, the banyan tree. And I was reminded the first passage you opened your book with. Once you opened your eyes to the world, you can never shut them again. And indeed, it's so difficult to stay open, to stay open-minded, to be porous, but almost facing all of these global crises that we have to stay open. We have to stay multi-rooted. So following the theme of metaphors and symbolism, one thing that repeated a lot is the Shiva Nataraja statue depicted here. And here's the Hindu god Shiva as the Lord of Dance, perfectly balancing on one foot with 4 arms, holding multiple instruments and hand gestures. One observation here is that Shiva in this pose is perfectly still, balanced yet in dynamic movements. You talked a lot about Shiva in your book. Can you share with us some of your favorite memories about Shiva, and what does Shiva Nataraja statue mean to you?
Well, Junjie, first, I know that sculpture means a lot to you as well. So for me, that in itself says something. Here you come from China. When you first came, you saw that image, a similar image at the Metropolitan Museum, and it kind of called you, as it were. So for me, that image is something you and I share. So that's very special. Yeah. The thing about Dancing Shiva that I will say, when Shagun asked about images, that is one image that has stayed constant with me, but I've also looked at it in very different ways. So first time I was very aware of it was when I had my first solo recital. You saw the image from that, the brochure and all that. And I was nervous. I was 18 years old and I had to do this big solo recital, and bowing to that image kind of calmed me down to just gather myself. And that was my first impression. I didn't think much about it, except for the fact that it was a ritual, you did it, but I noticed what it did for me. And then the next time that I thought about that is that because I had been a dancer from age of 7 till, I don't want to say how long, but for a long time. And then I'm in Cleveland. And before that, I performed in Santa Barbara, all over, other parts of India. And I get this job to work at the Cleveland Museum because somebody saw me dance and talk about dance and sculpture relationship. So let's show that image of right there. Here I am, 21 years old, right at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'd never done anything in a museum like that, although I grew up with lots of art around me. And to work with these African-American kids, many of whom were taller than I was, they didn't know where India was. They didn't know anything, but here they were For 6 weeks, once a week, they came to me and we spent a whole day in the galleries making art, thinking about art. And the dancing Shiva was one of the images that we really started talking about. And it was that idea of what Kumaraswamy has called perpetual movement, perpetually poised, being centered. And they began to realize that if you wanted to take that pose, you have to be calm and centered right at your belly button. Otherwise, you'll fall over. And then lead with your left leg and go up and stay poised. And then have the energy of the dance. And that really made me think that it's also conceptually very important, because in this one image is the concept of creation, destruction, preservation, and recreation. And at another level, it's about concept of ignorance that you need to destroy inside yourself to illuminate yourself to get the new idea. So then I began to think about its philosophical meaning. And when I stepped down from the Asia Society, one of my colleagues, and that's in the book too, she did a picture of dancing Shiva with my head on it. And saying,
I have
you
it
are the
right
dancing
here.
Shiva, right there, right, exactly. And it was funny, but what I realized is sometimes I have thought about dancing Shiva as these multiple arms going all over the map. I feel myself like that I'm all over the map. I love too many things. I'm interested in too many things, but how to be centered. And that's the idea of centrality, or finding your center inside yourself while you explore, is actually the metaphor of the dancing Shiva that's very powerful for me.
There's a saying in Chinese, qi hui dan tian, that your qi needs to be centered at the belly button.
And you know where that comes from? Yoga.
Ah,
That's exactly what the yoga principle is. And that's the connection between the chi notion, Tai Chi, movement, and yoga.
thank you. Thank you.
You know, this is one of the things that I loved about the book when I first read it also, because it's like a lot of books that we read, you know, they are either about the person who's writing, they're either about, you know, one thing or the other. But I say this to anyone who asks me about this book, or anyone I talk to basically who doesn't even ask me, because I tell everyone about the book, is that this book is about everything all together. Right. So like you're talking about the Shiva statue and finding your core and finding your center and finding your individual. But the book is also a lot about finding your belonging and finding your identity and yourself in relation to society. Right. And, you know, a lot of times individual and society are seen at odds with each other. But this book is about finding both and then putting both together in a way. And that's something that reminds me of the phrase Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which you use, to start the book, which is a Vedic phrase, which means to treat the world as family. And it drives home the idea that everyone has to be treated with love and respect, that we give our family and also that we give ourselves in a way, which you talk about with the Shiva statue. So what does this phrase mean to you? And why does the world need to apply it, especially today in this kind of chaos that we're living in?
You know, those of you who know India and Indian culture, or from India, like you, Shagun, we've all heard this many times. It's kind of a cliched word, right? Vasudeva Kutumbakam, treat the world as family. So when I first thought of it, I was also nervous, to tell you the truth. And I thought, oh, it's too overused. It's too simplistic. Is it too idealistic? Is it going to work? And so even though I felt the meaning was right for me, and at the same time, I thought it's too idealistic, it's too overused. And in fact, I was going to give up on that title. And then COVID happens. And I said, oh my God, it just is what needs to be right now. And then I had a new understanding of that phrase, because what's brilliant about that phrase is that we all know what a family is. we know that in a family, functional family, let's say, that you learn how to be an individual in relation to the collective. You learn your independence while understanding your interdependence. It's a unit of analysis, as sociologists would say, that you can understand. And then to apply that to the world, that is the brilliance of that phase. That it's not the world part, it's the family part that's so important. And also to remember that the full phrase, which literally is 3,000 years old, starts by saying that only those of a limited mind think of their blood relatives as their family. Those of the magnanimous mind or the capacious mind think of the entire world and treat the world as family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And then I thought, oh, this is it. And yet recognizing that the global family is pretty dysfunctional. It ain't working right now. Why? Because we haven't figured out the independence in relation to interdependence. We haven't actually thought about the collective and the individual in relation to one another. And to some extent, in fact, lots of people are now writing about it, is that we recognize you need both. You need the collective, you need the society, you need the belonging, and you need the individual. If the West, especially in America, has taught us really what it means to be an individual, there are cultures that do think about the collective, but you need both in relation to one another. And that is what what this particular phrase teaches us. And that, it seemed to me, with COVID and climate crisis, is actually a perfect phrase that we need to keep thinking about how to make our dysfunctional global family more functional.
No, I even when I describe the book to people and I say that, we as young people keep asking, where is home? And, where do we find ourselves? I think this is a great place to start. This book is a great place to start because it tells you who you are and finding yourself, and then also finding the world and finding family. But over to you, Yasmine.
So we know that this book has been in the working for years, but what about this moment made you want to publish Worldless Family now? And I know we've touched on this a bit earlier with the previous question, but I just wanted to ask, how has COVID exactly changed the way we form identity and find community?
Well, there are a couple of things that this moment, the last year, I think has taught us. One is that we really haven't figured out how to think of ourselves in relation to the larger community, so that when push comes to shove, we want to first take care of ourselves. But we've also shown that actually we have helped other people, and we have gone out of our way to really help each other. At the same time, especially in America and elsewhere, it has also really laid bare the kind of fissures of the society. That means economic inequity, the Asian violence that we saw, Asian American violence against Asian Americans, we saw in America, George Floyd murder. All of these things also remind us that when you put people in individual boxes and you don't allow them any other identity than the one you give them. So if Asian Americans are seen as not American enough, that they're somehow related to the China virus, therefore, let's really hurt all these East Asian American looking people, or even in George Floyd's case, that it is about not recognizing people as fully human and individually fully human, not just one particular type. And all of this really does show us is that whether it comes to social inequity, whether it comes to climate crisis, whether it comes to pandemics, we better figure out how to treat our fellow human beings as fully human beings. Remind ourselves that more than 99% of our DNA is the same. And actually, the cover of the book is one of the human cells that is used, that my husband did as a painting, to kind of open it up as an idea of this tiny microscopic cell that actually connects to the world. So let's keep reminding ourselves. And I think this is the moment we can either continue to break up into tiny little places. And I understand it is about fear, it is about ignorance, and it's about political use of that fear to make people into us against them. It's time for us to think about us while recognizing our individuality and humanity, our specific cultural, specific identities, but as part of us, the humanity. And it sounds romantic, it sounds idealistic, but you know what? We got to start somewhere. So that's what I hope we can do. And I count on all of you guys to do it, because the world is your oyster much more than mine.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I think that's a great. I think this was great, and we've kind of had a really good question and answer session with the questions we prepared, and all four of us, all three of us, actually were very excited. And we've read the book maybe 7 times to come up with these questions. But we now want to open it up to our audience. I would just repeat the rules. If you want to go ahead and ask a question, please raise your hand. We will spotlight you and you can go ahead and do that. If you want to put your question in the chat, you can do that as well. And I'd be happy to read it out. To start us off, maybe I can ask one of the questions that's in the chat right now. So Katerina asks that as someone from an immigrant family living in New York, the experiences that you shared with us were very inspiring and thought-provoking. My question is, how has the immigrant experience shaped your passions and journey with women's rights and equality?
Shagun, not surprisingly, you picked up that question, right? I think that, Katharina, thank you for the question. For me, it actually began even before I came to the United States, because my mother actually was one of the co-founders of the first women's organization in India during the time of independence. So I kind of grew up with this notion that as a woman, you got to make sure that you are your own self. As she used to tell us, that marriage was a choice, not a foregone conclusion. And therefore, think of marriage as a comma, not a full stop, not a period at the end of a sentence. And therefore, there was something about that notion that women could do anything, all of that was part of me. But then realizing that coming here, obviously I'm of a certain age. There are moments when it was not unusual when I was 27 years old, right in the Boston Museum. It's not in the book because I didn't want to go there, but actually an older gentleman who was a leader at the museum. And I asked him about some budget question, and he says to me, well, how can you be so attractive and so smart at the same time? Yeah, exactly. So I didn't know what to say. And I said, gee, I didn't know that those were mutually exclusive. And then I just joked and moved right along and so forth and so on. But in Santa Barbara High School, one thing that I did notice is that in America, actually, there were more of this notion that you either were a nerd and a smart kid, or you were the cheerleader and a dancer. Now here I was a dancer, I had danced all my life, and I did pretty well in the school. So I didn't know that I had to choose between two groups. And these two groups are very divisive. And that I think is something strange because I didn't grow up that way. So to some extent, I had more of a sense of myself as a woman in some ways. Now, mind you, I don't want to romanticize the Indian situation because in India, there's also a huge amount of problem with women and marriage and abuse and so forth and so on. But I also think that there is something, if you happen to be in a particular mindset in a family, that it is not true. So I would say the navigation is more of an evolution for me. And I continue to look at it from a cultural perspective. And I also think that in some cases, like especially in America, people have talked about bamboo ceiling or women of color, where color will trump gender, or there is a double issue of color, ethnicity, and gender. And those are cultural concepts that also have to be really put into practice. And sometimes I find that a lot of my Euro-American friends and women have not always made that distinction. And I think it's important for us to really look at this intersectionality of the different elements that come together. And that I think is very important as we go forward.
Well, Vishakha, you talked about the Shiva statue earlier and how it had changed my life. I saw the Shiva statue in the Met and I changed my major from business to religion. So this question from the chat by Taskino, sorry for mispronouncing your name, really resonated with me. They asked, what do you think of the importance of religion in leading a happy life and feeling happy in time of distress or away from home from the experiences you have?
Nice question. I think it's a complex question because there is something about organized religion that is quite different from belief systems and spiritual practice that actually can help you. And so I make a distinction between organized religion and that religious practice that you may find for yourself. I'm not saying good or bad, I'm just saying that to make that distinction. And the second thing is that whether you have a religious practice or not, reflection, mindfulness, taking the time to check in where you are, what's going on, and to have some space for that reflection, I think is important. It's important to me. And I do think that it is one of the ways you find your center. Now, some people may find their center through dance. Some people may find it by going to Sunday service. Some people may find it going to a Zen temple. All of that is fine. I mean, one good thing in the Indic tradition, and I don't say Hindu tradition, but Indic tradition, is that it's recognized there are multiple paths. The goal is to find your center and recognizing your infinity in connection to the world's infinity. Ultimately, it's trying to understand the relationship of yourself to the universe, whichever way it works, but find that space to reflect on it. So I wouldn't say that religion per se is the only way to go. It may be, but it doesn't have to be. But let's also recognize that in the name of religion, we have fought more wars. And that is also a problem. And once religion gets in, which I talk about with the war in Vietnam, is that once religion gets in, it's very hard to have a rational discussion. So make sure that we make a distinction between religion as it's politicized and religion as in practice for your own well-being, and making the distinction.
We have some questions in the chat too, so I'm just going to club a couple of them together in the interest of time. So we have a very interesting question, which is that, someone, Dilip says that, he also has multi-rooted belonging. And he says that as an immigrant, there's so much violence that, we tend to face when we're not in our home countries. And growing up in India, ahimsa has been such a cultural root for us. And Gandhi is such a driving factor for you as well. And we've grown up with this idea of nonviolence. So how have you navigated this principle that people like us come with of ahimsa, given this context of violence that we live in? I'm going to ask the second question also, which is related to this, I think, which is that, Rejeb asked this question, which is that, we tend to turn our anger when one person commits a crime against the whole community. And this affects the global image of the community. We've all seen this with Islamophobia and other kinds of, ostracizations of religion. So how do you think we can overcome this problem and find the world as truly as family?
Right. I mean, I do think of that emotional reaction whereby by having one person become the symbol of the whole community. Actually, as Dilip says, it goes both ways. When you might have committed that in your home country against somebody who is different from you might also happen to you when you come to another country and it happens to you. So the reality is that part of it is actually when you actually put somebody in a box and saying, if that person does it, that means everybody is bad. We don't actually make a distinction. So I also feel that the question of ahimsa, we might say it's rooted in India. Yes, but you know what? Gandhi was killed by somebody, and partition had millions of people who died. So the country that has given us ahimsa has also given us violence, because religion was politicized, because people actually did not use their mind. I mean, when I talk about mindfulness and reflection, is actually in a Buddhist tradition, it is to do with just stop. When your emotion takes the better of you, come back, reflect. In a way, it's like therapy, you know. How many of us have done therapy and a therapist says, yes, if you're mad, write it down. Just don't send the letter. Think about it. Think about it before you do that. That mindfulness, a lot of Buddhist psychologists have talked about this, is to actually stop. When 2002 happened in India, in Gujarat especially, when there was such huge violence perpetrated against Muslims, it shattered me. And I felt so sad because my father was always the first person when there was violence to go and actually try to stop it. And one of the reasons why we have to think about it is to remember what Gandhi said, and that is, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Violence is never the answer. And by the way, there's a wonderful film that's just coming out called Ahimsa. And it is a beautiful film that I actually had the occasion to interview the director. And he talks about the legacy of Ahimsa and nonviolent struggle and its morality and the moral basis in other parts of the world. So it starts with Gandhi and it goes to Martin Luther King and to Mandela and to Poland and to Czechoslovakia, where Havel talks about how the only thing they had was that power because tanks could roll in and there was no answer to that tank except for their moral commitment. And that is the idea of having agency that I think is very important. And so I hope that one of the things we have to do is that as human beings, we are capable of the utmost atrocities. And we are capable of utmost generosity. Where are we going to put our energy? And somebody who's an IR specialist on NPR interview asked me and said, oh yeah, this sounds too idealistic, but world is falling apart. We are absolutely broken into small little parts. How are we going to do that? And I said, I recognize the world is half full and half empty. Maybe it's even more empty than it's full. As I said, the global family is dysfunctional. But are we going to do our part to make it a little fuller, a little bit more generous, a little bit better? Then that's the only thing we can do. And that's my goal. You know, I don't for a minute think that it's totally easy. I recognize that. But if all of us who believe in it come together, then it's our goal to have to push it. We got to do it. Because otherwise, the other side, between climate, between pandemic, it's pretty dire if we don't take care of it. So let's get on with it.
Thank you so much, Vishakha, for your insights and for taking the time to answer all of our questions. Thanks to everyone in attendance and of course to my amazing fellow panelists, Shagun and Junjie. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Comedy on Global Thought of Columbia University. Special shout outs go to Andrew for his amazing support and all around awesomeness. to also One Shared World, MUN Impact, AFS, and Colombia's Global Centers, in addition to Global Youth, Now and Me, Teach for All, African Leadership Institute, Global China Connection, International House, New York, Office of University Life of Columbia University, Public Affairs of Columbia University, and the MCW, the Global Young Leaders Conference. Please feel free, everyone, to follow us on our handles on Instagram, World as Family, and on Twitter, Vishakha and Desai. And don't forget to use the code CUP20 while ordering your copy of World as Family. Thank you so much for attending this conversation, and hopefully see you well.
Thank you. This was absolutely fabulous. I can't thank you all enough. You were awesome, all of you. Thanks for this great discussion. And thank you all who have participated and joined us. Look forward to having more conversations. Thanks.
Thank you, Vishakha.
Yeah.